Good evening, everyone, and good morning in other parts of the world and good afternoon in others. I'm very happy to welcome you to this People's Health Movement side meeting of the PMAC campaign, PMAC conference. And what we're going to do in the next 3 hours is introduce you to 3 videos that PHM has made, which has been financed by PMAC, but has also involved a lot of voluntary effort from PHM people, particularly including Sundar, our global coordinator, and Devaki, who's given a lot of volunteer time to these videos, and Salakshana, my co-chair of PHM. We've got 3 videos to show, and they're really PHM's response to the title of this year's PMAC conference, which is The World We Want. So in these 3 videos, we've really thought about, well, what is the world that we want in terms of PHM? And to do that, we've really drawn on our key document, the People's Health Charter, that was developed following the first People's Health Assembly that was held in Bangladesh in 2000. And that philosophy, even though the world's changed considerably, has remained remarkably constant and remarkably relevant to all the issues that, health issues that we're facing in the world, whether it's climate change, whether it's access to food, clean environments, or of course access to health services. So I'm very, very happy to introduce these videos, and I just want to check whether Dr. Suwit from representing PMAC is online, because we were going to ask him to say a few words. Do we know if Dr. Suwit, maybe if he's not online at the moment, he may join us in a bit and we will be able to hear from him in terms of the PMAC response. I can see that lots of people are joining us. If you look in the chat, people are saying hello, saying where they're from, and giving us an idea that we have people here from Europe, from Thailand, of course, from India, from South Africa, and from Australia and many other countries, I think. So please keep putting in the chat where you're from. We'll be showing the 3 videos. One is about how likely it is that the SDGs can be achieved in the wake of the COVID pandemic and the impact that the pandemic has had on the chances of achieving the SDGs. We'll be showing that one first, and I'll say a little bit more about that. And then the second video that Salakshana Nandi, who I said is co-chair of the People's Health Movement, will be introducing, which is on building equitable health systems. And it's really giving PHM's view of what an equitable health system is like, and has views from different parts of the world. And then finally, we'll be joined by Ron Labonte from Canada, who oversaw the development of the 3rd video, which is on post-pandemic global economics and about restructuring, reform, or just revitalizing. It's very early in the morning in Canada, and Ron will join us in time to introduce that 3rd video. So so I think at this point then I'll go on to introduce the first video. In this first video, we really wanted to think about the SDGs in the pandemic aftermath. But of course, we also take a critical look at the whole notion of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we really unpick the fact that there is a sort of contradiction at their heart between achieving those goals and the continued focus on an economic system that produces, by virtue of its nature, huge economic inequities, which of course translate into health inequities. So we really wanted to unpick that, and we have done that by taking views from Rwanda, from Australia, a commentator from Canada, who you will see, who will be introduced in the video, and asking the question, well, what difference has COVID made? And I think in lots of ways, this first video really sets the scene for the other two, because it's speaking to the need for health services that are publicly funded and that are equitable. And it's also suggesting that we need to look at a different economic system, that we're unlikely to achieve the SDGs if we carry on with business as usual. And in the pandemic, that's really been highlighted, because that business as usual has created yet more inequities. And we know that in the future, they will translate into health inequities. So without further ado, we'll have to see now whether the technology works, but let's have a look at the screening of the first video. It's just about half an hour. The second video is about 20 minutes and the third one is 35 minutes. And we intend to have an open discussion at the end of that. So can we show the first video, please?
What needs to change? Rethinking the SDGs in the pandemic aftermath. The world we want. Actions towards a sustainable, fairer and healthier society.
Difficult to think about the SDGs from 2015 forwards. Rather, we need to go back to the very founding of the United Nations and the expectations around what the UN would bring, not only in terms of peace, a lasting peace, but also in the new and shifting world of decolonization, creation of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. And these institutions, while on one level were designed to help Europe and other countries deeply affected by the Second World War, as well as the Great Depression, to recover economically, they soon turned to focus on the so-called developing world, or what came to be known by the 1950s as the Third World.
In understanding where we stand with the Sustainable Development Goals at this present moment, it is important to take note of how we got here.
The MDGs came out of the UN and kind of donor development apparatus, and did not, in many ways, take into account the voices and efforts and the know-how and the lived experience of countries of what was now became called the Global South. I prefer the term majority world, but we can save that discussion for later. So the MDGs ended up becoming not only depoliticized, but highly technocratic and focused on metrics. And, a number of scholars have looked at the extent to which the measures of poverty went through gymnastics just to justify success of the MDGs. So, what counted as poverty kept shifting, and, with the baseline moved from 2000 back to 1990 and so on. While there was economic growth in some settings that had been jump-started, this did not lead to any kind of decrease in inequality or kind of improvement in what you might consider some key development indicators, at least according to even World Bank and IMF standards.
The SDGs, as they are known, are part of the history of the United Nations, which itself is nested in the history of the post-war era, with many contradictions, power hierarchies, and a looming legacy of colonialism.
Before we were a German colony, the United Nations did two inspection visits, let's say like that, and they blamed the Belgians for not developing the education system. So when the day we were decolonized, we didn't have the national workforce to run the country and to develop the country. We're economically depraved and lacked qualified human resource. And what we did, what our leaders at that time did, they looked to the colonizer of yesterday for support. And what happened? You have seen that the rich countries create new partnership and multilateral organization that, again, create a colonial model of power dynamics and continue to divert African wealth at the profit of rich countries.
It was this complex history that led up in 2015 to 193 countries of the United Nations committing to achieving by 2030 17 Sustainable Development Goals that would lead to dignity, prosperity, and peace for the planet and for all of humankind. There were many reasons for welcoming SDGs as a different way of thinking about development.
The SDGs, as well as the MDGs, are North Stars that help countries and organizations who seek improve human development to function. However, the countries have to adapt them to their context. The country has to have its own plan, ambitious plan. And the advantage of having a system or framework like the SDGs is that it concerns health, education, employment, etc. So you can have a facilitation for all the sectors in a country to work against one goal, the development.
Of these, first 8 goals address the requirements of a life with dignity for all of humanity. These goals include an end to poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being for all, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, and affordable and clean energy, economic development, and decent work. Next 4 goals articulate the priorities of nature of industrialization required, reduction of inequalities, building sustainable cities, and responsible patterns of consumption and production. In other words, these goals are saying that economic growth must mean far more than just increasing GDP. Next 3 goals deal with ecosystems' health and make the point there can be no development that doesn't respect planetary health. Last 2 goals are on peace and solidarity. More than just representing an increase in number, the Sustainable Development Goals differed from the earlier Millennium Development Goals known as MDGs, and understanding this is important.
These are all interlinked. I don't want to see in silos 3, 5, 17 and all, but there is a deep interlinkage of goal 3 particularly, and with the 5, and also with other SDGs, whether it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and it can go on to emphasize and our weather demand at times within the policy framework, because we have committed to SDG 2030. So this is where I think SDGs they provided a kind of umbrella framework for prioritizing issues of concern.
What development goals could do in the context of sustainable development, so in the context of Rio plus 20, you have Paula Caballero Gomez, who thought that Rio plus 20 should and could incorporate this idea of sustainable development goals. And so a whole series of actors from the global south, from the majority world, played into the development of these SDGs. So quite different confirmation from, at least in terms of the cast of characters, from who put together the MDGs. And so in part, this explains the many more SDGs that were included compared to MDGs.
Now the question is, will SDGs fare any better than the MDGs? There is no denying that progress towards SDGs have been seriously set back by the economic and social crisis that the COVID pandemic has created, more so in developing countries. But this also provides an opportunity to rethink the roadmaps, the approach to SDGs learning, both from the MDGs and from the COVID crisis.
Of course, they were meant to be inspirational, and to some extent they were, but they fundamentally didn't consider the existing global economic order and the way in which, particularly in the last 3 decades of neoliberalism, has really increased global income and health inequities.
It is good that SDGs are more comprehensive than MDGs, that includes processes as well as outcomes. The SDGs also address equity. Though it is pointed out, it does not address the roots of inequality. But is it enough? What problems remain unaddressed? What do we do differently?
And when they come and with goodwill and want to help you, they want to be your master without even understand that they misbehave, that they should be better listen to you and go your way for your development. Project that pull them out of poverty. Focus and identify by the people who know the best. It's not the people in Kigali who know the people in the village. It's the people in the village who know really the people in need in the village.
Don't just measure people just scraping out of poverty, but they actually get out of poverty to a level that means they have a meaningful life, a life which is decent. And that really should be our goal, not just a limiting, so not just saying it's so many dollars per day, but actually looking at the style of life that people have.
I think that you need to focus on the most vulnerable and create excellence where you can for bringing the most vulnerable out of poverty, breaking the cycle of disease and poverty.
If we look at Africa, in the end of 2021, only about 10% of the population were fully vaccinated. And of course, that is likely to make everyone unsafe because variants will emerge and we will just find the coronavirus is making us all much more vulnerable.
And I'm very pleased for the European and the American people. However, they should share this wealth they have with African countries who want now to develop their capacity to produce vaccine. Why? Only because there is not enough vaccine on the market. It's even not to compete, They just say that they need to keep us where we are so that we can always be the consumer of the good they produce, so that they continue to be rich and we continue to be consumer of the product they do. Self-sufficient Africa is not welcome.
Habla de pobreza. Entonces hay un principio filosófico del buen vivir en donde no debería de haber una preeminencia económica entre las personas, entre los pueblos. O sea, está en contra de la pobreza. No está en contra de la riqueza, porque puede haber riqueza de diferente tipo, pero sí está en contra de la pobreza. Entonces,
even now during COVID, during the lockdown, those who suffer the most are the poor, who need to do something today, find a work to eat tomorrow. So the head of the village made accountable that all the poor in their village receive a support for nutrition for their family.
The lockdown started in March. We call it ayuda or help. The help came only in May. So how would you make the people survive from March to May if you have no other support? So there were philanthropists, there were organized people in organized communities with NGOs, etc., who raised funds, but they were being harassed.
Some of these issues with the SDG framework really came to the fore with COVID. But many other issues have been there from before.
Even within this framework, when we say gender equality, we need to bring in even different sexual expressions and sexual orientations, which is not coming in this. But still, one can apply because it is gender equality. We can try and use it in our own work when we are looking at the vulnerable groups.
Health, we know the most fundamental thing for us is the health of the planet. And if we don't ensure that, then none of us are going to have a healthy future. Just in this country, we spend $10.3 billion a year subsidizing fossil fuel industries. Now, that is the commercial determinant of health, because unless we can transform those subsidies away from fossil fuels, which are threatening all our futures, to renewable energies and other forms of energy, then we can't be a healthy planet or a healthy society or a healthy country. Another commercial determinant of health is the food industry. And we see in countries around the world, as many countries having a double burden of infectious disease and then also non-communicable disease. And much of that can be tracked back to the expansion of the fast food industry and the way in which it is marketing high fat, high sugar, sweetened beverages, and that is vastly increasing people's susceptibility to non-communicable diseases like diabetes and heart disease and so on. So I think in the future, we really do need to focus much more on, certainly on social determinants, but also on commercial determinants of health.
The food program has historically sidestepped local production, or how land grabs and the expansion of big food, the five major corporations involved in food production, have actually displaced sustainable agricultural development. 10, 15 years ago, WHO and the World Bank and the Rockefeller Foundation devised these ideas around universal health coverage, which sounds, again, unobjectionable. It actually opened the door to further privatization of healthcare, as well as circumscribing what would count as universal.
And this is where we see that previously we already have a very poor public health system. It has been worsened by the COVID pandemic. So what we see here is that the gaps in the health services are due to a very weakened public health system. We have very low budget for our public health, and it is even worsened by the continuous budget cuts that the government is imposing, because we are subject to neoliberal policies, and therefore what they are pushing for is privatization of the health system.
So you can link SDGs to all the social determinants of health. Now, the clarity is so fragile that you can do whatever you want with the SDGs, the best and the nothing. I chose to do the best. So that means the basic is you cannot go for economic development without human development.
The challenges that the SDGs seek to address, and those challenges that transcend the SDGs, are ones that we must now prioritize. We must first do more than describing problems, relying on technocratic solutions that reinforce colonial power hierarchies. Alternatives exist, and we need to recognize them, honor them, and nurture them.
El buen vivir es una forma de vida, donde el ser humano es parte de un todo. Cuando hablamos de un todo, decimos que es parte entonces de la madre tierra, del agua, del aire, del cosmos, del universo, de todas las formas de vida existentes. Es una forma de vida holística porque es dinámica, es complementaria, es equilibrada para que exista armonía.
Ways in which infrastructure could be life-giving, whether that's clean water or a way of connecting communities and so on, not concentrating resources. I think these two very promising avenues, one being indigenous ideas around how nature is our curriculum, our school, and living within the natural world and the balances, ecological balances, will enable our continuation as a species, but also mitigate against militarism, greed, extraction, and so on.
I would focus on that question of disrupting the economic model and looking at how we can reduce those economic inequities. The neoliberal model has led to a massive increase in the power and influence of transnational corporations. And of course, they have got themselves in a position after 3 decades of neoliberalism where they're hardly paying any tax compared to the average citizen. So we really need to reduce those tax havens. We're currently heavily subsidizing corporations, and they added up the tax that's avoided, the subsidies that are given by governments, the excessive profits. And they said there would be $1 trillion per annum if you took all that into account, and then asked us to imagine what you could do with that. And of course, if you had that kind of fund, then you could really begin to look at achieving the SDGs, as promoting tax justice, implementing universal social protection for everybody, making the role of government central. And I would add to that, ensuring that we have really strong public services rather than privatized services, because we know privatized services do not pay attention to equity.
The policies or the programs or any demographic or health surveys, they have to take into account and address these, whether it is a socio-economic disparity or the marginalizations with the intersectionality, where one is looking at on the basis of whether it is race, caste, class, or disability or sexual identity, and also geographical location and the religion. We can go on, occupation, and all that can come into that. That intersectionality is very important.
The bottom 50% of the global population control at least 20% of the wealth by 2030. We need that kind of redistribution. Whereas that still is very unequal. But if we can't achieve that kind of adjustment, then I don't think we can achieve the SDGs. And to introduce a global financial transaction tax. And I think we should use that to establish global, lifelong social security for everybody in the world. And that might sound like a pipe dream, but we actually have enough money to do that.
Don't follow the partnership path. Don't follow what doesn't matter. That is not good for you. Like in everything, take what you like, what is good for you. It's like when you go to a restaurant, don't eat what you don't like. Take on the menu what suits what you want to eat. Same for the SDGs. Just design your own rules. It's good to follow what sister countries are doing. If they are doing better, go and learn. If they are not doing better, exchange, because we can learn mutually.
When people are involved in local government, when people are involved in policy-making processes. And sometimes that can be done very well. Sometimes it's tokenistic. But I think participatory governance is absolutely vital to achieving an elimination of poverty.
Bastante la atención en el sentido de que habla del bienestar y vida sana. Entonces, creo que el bienestar también podríamos de alguna manera reenfocarlo hacia esto de buen vivir. No solamente estar bien, sino vivir bien. Y tener una vida sana. ¿Qué implica una vida sana? Entonces ahí podríamos también enfocarlo a más que una vida sana, una vida en plenitud, bajo un concepto de salud integral. El ecosistema, los ecosistemas, creo que tiene bastante relación acá con el buen vivir, en el sentido entonces de que estamos de nuevo no colocando al ser humano como centro y como dueño de todo, sino como parte de los diferentes sistemas. Desde la óptica y desde la visión del buen vivir, podríamos reenfocar varios elementos de los objetivos de desarrollo.
One small country that has dared to be different has come up with a big idea, proposing an alternative index to measuring development. Not GDP, but GNH, that is, Gross National Happiness.
As per GNH, economic growth is not the only way to measure progress, and we believe that progress should be viewed from a social, from a ecological, cultural, spiritual perspectives as well. The role of the government to create conducive environment for people to pursue their happiness is enshrined in the Constitution, and the government does that through 4 pillars of GNH. First is the equitable, sustainable and equitable socioeconomic development. Second, conservation of environment. And we have other domains like psychological well-being, education, time use, community vitality, living standards, and good governance, ecological diversity. So this, in a nutshell, is gross national happiness.
As Paulo Freire wrote in 1978, authentic help, and this can never be said enough, is that in which all who are involved help each other, growing together in the common effort of understanding the reality they seek to transform.
This is a statement, it's a choice. It's a political choice. It's a development choice. It's a human choice. It's a human right choice. SDGs, don't blame them. Blame your choice.
Oh, bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 seppellirai lassù in montagna sotto l'ombra di un bel fiore.
Well, thank you. I hope you enjoyed the video, and just a reminder to put any questions into the Q&A, and we can come to those later, but it would really be good to see those. And at this point, I'll hand over to Salakshana Nandi to introduce the second video, which is on building equitable health systems. Over to you, Salakshana.
Yeah, thank you, Fran. I'm sure we have been quite inspired by the video that we just saw. So I will now be introducing to you the video on building equitable health systems. One of the main reasons behind the current crisis that we see in healthcare globally has been the failure of the global community to call for and provide assistance to strengthening the public sector health service delivery. And this has been made more evident during the COVID-19 pandemic. So using our experiences during the pandemic as a starting point, this video analyzes the implications of chronic public underinvestment in the public health sector and the active promotion of the for-profit private sector and accelerated commercialization of healthcare, particularly for those who have been historically marginalized and who actually bore the brunt of exposure, infection, morbidity, and death due to COVID. We hear from health workers, community health workers, and health activists on conceptualizing healthcare as a public good and a public service and a right. We look at approaches of various countries and governments such as Costa Rica, El Salvador, and India in building their healthcare systems and look at what has worked and what hasn't. Building on PHM's vision for health for all, we discuss alternatives to the dominant market-oriented discourse and privatization of healthcare. We present lessons, principles, and strategies for building strong and equitable public health systems that promote social justice and human rights and put people over profit. And I'll just switch on the video right now.
Medicine, as we are practicing it, is a luxury trade. We are selling bread at the price of jewels. Let us take the profit, the private economic profit out of medicine and purify our profession of rapacious individualism. Let us say to the people not how much have you got, but how best can we serve you. Norman Batoon. The world we want. Actions towards a sustainable, fairer, and healthier society. Building equitable health systems. COVID-19 pandemic is the worst crisis that has happened so far in the 21st century. How often we have ignored our vulnerability by pretending new technologies and the economic growth rate is all that matters. COVID-19 has caused 6.9 million deaths globally, more than double what official reports show. 140 million people were freshly pushed into extreme poverty due to COVID. 1.6 billion informal economy workers due to COVID-19 and lockdown have suffered massive damage to their capacity to earn a living. And millions of people displaced across all regions. Schools for more than 168 million children globally have been completely closed for almost a full year. And this is the time, therefore, for reflection and for urgent action. A time to rebuild a more sustainable, fairer, and healthier society. We explored this theme in 3 parts. The first of which is on building equitable health systems.
कोविड के समय में भी केवल सरकारी अस्पताल ही हैं जो सारी सेवाएं समुदाय को दे रही थी, बिना किसी भेदभाव के दे रही थी। तो जो प्राइवेट हॉस्पिटल है उन्होंने लगभग सब कुछ बंद करके रख दिया था और जहां पर कुछ ट्रीटमेंट की सेवाएं उपलब्ध थी तो वहां पर भी बहुत सारे पैसे जो है समुदाय के खर्च हो रहे थे।
The migrant people are not always covered by the health system, and that is a need.
We also wanted to bring in voices from different kinds of, professionals, medical professionals, community health workers, and the community to help us understand what we mean by building back better. Because clearly, as the COVID pandemic has shown us, it's not enough to simply build back things the way they were before, because they clearly sort of failed to respond to the kind of situation.
आथे गोठी आथे ओकर बोली हा मिठा थे आथे गोठी आथे ओकर बोली हा मिठा थे नोनी बाबू दाई दीदी के मन लौहा भाथे नोनी बाबू दाई दीदी के मन लौहा भाथे रही थे मितानी ने हमारे गाँव माँ।
मिताइन कार्यक्रम का डिजाइन किया जा रहा था उस समय। अन्य इस तरह के जो कम्युनिटी हेल्थ वर्कर कार्यक्रम जो हैं उनका स्टडी किया गया और उसमें जो फैक्टर थे कि जो सफलता के जो कारण दिख रहे थे उन चीज़ों को इस कार्यक्रम में समाहित करने की कोशिश की गई। फिर इसके सिलेक्शन प्रोसेस में मितानिन का चयन समुदाय के द्वारा किया जाता है।
हेल्थ सिस्टम दैट इज कम्युनिटी लेड, कम्युनिटी बेस्ड, in which communities' participation is there, from the planning to the, monitoring and evaluation stage, that is very critical.
Ang pandemya ay matutugunan o ang ating pamahalaan ay bibigyang prioridad ang pangkalusugan ng mamamayan, hindi sa sariling interes. Maglalantad sa kaganapan at kalagayan ng health workers para maprotektahan sila. Pagkakaroon ng mass hiring ng mga health workers, pagpapakita ng hindi epektibong pamamalakad ng pamahalaan sa problemang pangkalusugan ng bansa.
Naisasantabi rin ang iba pang isyong pangkalusugan dahil nakafocus lamang sa pagsugpo sa COVID-19, katulad na lamang ng pagbabakuna sa mga sanggol, pagtugon sa mga nagdadialysis, buntis at iba pang may mga karamdaman.
समय पर डॉक्टर नहीं रहते हैं, हम लोग इधर उधर भटकते रहते हैं, दवाई सही समय पे नहीं मिल पाते हैं और जैसे कोई कारणवश से कोई केस मतलब वहाँ नहीं हो पाते तो हम लोगों को बाहर रिफर कर देते हैं, तो इससे हम लोगों को भी परेशानी होते हैं। तो हम लोग चाहते हैं कि सभी चीज़ वहाँ उपलब्ध हो।
Some of the patients they stay very longer, maybe 5 to 10 kilometers radius, so that you cover them. You are not provided even a push bike. You walk on foot.
सबको एकजुट होकर जैसे हम लोग आवेदन बना के देते हैं और शासन के पास पहुंचाना चाहिए ये सब बात को, ताकि सरकार हम लोग का और अच्छे से मदद कर सके। वहाँ स्टाफ को कमी है तो स्टाफ दे सके, CSC PSC में स्टाफ दे और वो सारी सुविधा दे ताकि लोगों को ये परेशानी ना आए।
Government has even more decentralized to Makkalai Thedi Maruthuvam. So we go house by house to give them treatment with trained personals and mid-level health providers. So we have all levels of people who readily take up our services.
स्वास्थ्य सेवा को सुधारने के लिए मतलब जो भी योजनाएं हैं वो सब तक पहुँचे, अमीर गरीब, इसमें जाति धर्म ऐसा कुछ भेदभाव नहीं होना चाहिए, सभी तक मुफ्त में मिलना चाहिए और सभी प्रकार की सेवाएं मुफ्त में मिले।
Fala, entra em debate, faz reuniões, leva até a comunidade. Também posso falar que a gente, nas comunidades, trabalha com terapia comunitárias, né? É um trabalho lindo, maravilhoso, que é um dos que eu mais gosto de fazer, que é um trabalho que é direto mesmo na comunidade.
The relationship between the provider and the patient, the relationship between the facility and the community, it's a relationship of solidarity. It is a relationship of mutual trust, of respect, where the healthcare is there to be experienced, not to be sold. It's its use value, not its exchange value that determines it. And actually, healthcare is a relationship between the people who are involved in it. That's important.
Y en fin, se estimuló una organización comunitaria en salud muy potente, que fue el Foro Nacional de Salud, que forma parte del Movimiento de Salud de los Pueblos, y se formularon muchas políticas conjuntamente con la comunidad. El Foro Nacional de Salud y el liderazgo en salud que estaba en su seno siempre estuvo presente en todas las políticas públicas que se formularon. Diseñamos un proceso participativo para ello. Entonces, todos estos fueron éxitos importantes que de alguna manera hay muchos más. Se eliminó la malaria, por ejemplo, se controlaron las epidemias de arbovirosis. Entonces, todos estos logros fueron una cuestión muy importante, todo lo cual fue auditado por organismos como la Organización Mundial de la Salud y por la Contraloría Social de la misma población.
That we cannot see one thing separated from the other. Both things go together. The human rights engagement, the commitment with human rights and the commitment with democracy go together. We cannot see these things separately. And I think that is a problem for some health workers that see these things divorce. We cannot see the things separate.
Todo esto debía sumar esfuerzos hacia la cobertura universal de salud, entendiendo salud como un concepto que no está limitado a los servicios de salud, sino que va más allá, involucra el trabajo intersectorial, el trabajo en la comunidad, es necesariamente mucho más amplio que los servicios de salud. Implicaba obviamente el acceso universal a la salud y la búsqueda constante de la equidad. Y por supuesto requería también de un ambiente que fuera sano y seguro a través de la promoción de la salud, la prevención de la enfermedad, la curación y la rehabilitación, que son elementos que obviamente no deben faltar.
During COVID-19 pandemic, less disruption of social life, less disruption of other health services, less death cases of the COVID-19. There are very many nations that have done so and relatively did better. Costa Rica, Cuba, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Vietnam, New Zealand, Iceland, and many others. What made these nations different?
One of the best things that it is a very inclusive system in the first place. In the second place, that is it's a right for everybody. Public health is a priority for all the governments. This is part of the national identity, the health system, a strong public health system.
Construir un sistema de salud que fuera único, público, universal, participativo, equitativo, que estuviera financiado por impuestos generales y de tal manera que no generara gasto de bolsillo adicional a la población al que ya tributan cuando pagan el IVA o cualquier otro impuesto directo o indirecto. Es el Estado el obligado a devolver ese dinero recolectado en servicios, y uno de ellos es la salud, precisamente, contribuir a construir la salud en la comunidad.
It's a decision that involves long time. It's not just something that you decide in this government and you will change in the next.
One of the key drivers of national policy should be that payments which are made for healthcare, budgets that are allocated, should not be grounded upon any considerations of commerce or profitability, but considered completely according to requirements and needs.
Costa Rica lo invirtió en desarrollar la salud y la educación, ¿verdad? Entonces, mientras que Costa Rica tuvo un desarrollo intelectual importante de sus instituciones educativas, ¿verdad? Tuvo un desarrollo importante de su sistema de salud, nuestro sistema de salud fue completamente abandonado para estimular precisamente el desarrollo del sistema privado para poder tenerlo como un mecanismo de lucro.
Τέτοιες στιγμές, θα αναφερθώ και κάτι που είπε ο συνάδελφος πριν. Κύριοι συνάδελφοι, διαπιστώνουμε το μεγαλείο του δημόσιου εθνικού συστήματος υγείας και διαπιστώνουμε πόσο ακριβώς άχρηστος και αναποτελεσματικός είναι ο ιδιωτικός τομέας υγείας. Ελπίζω αυτή η διαπίστωση που σίγουρα κάνετε κι εσείς να σας βοηθήσει να συνέλθετε από την ιδιωτικομανία και να ενισχύσετε το εσύ χωρίς ρητ, χωρίς κρυφές ιδιωτικοποίησεις εκ των έσω, αλλά με γνώμονα το δημόσιο συμφέρον, το οποίο ο ιδιωτικός τομέας όχι μόνο δεν εξυπηρετεί, αλλά συστηματικά υπονομεύει.
The health system in Costa Rica is made out of the contribution from the state, the entrepreneurs, and the workers. So everybody has some kind of contribution. So we know that the health system is ours, belongs to all of us. And I think that make us more responsible to how we manage and how we use the health system. That's, I think, another important aspect. And the other thing is that Costa Rica does not invest in national defense. It has no army. And that money goes to health and education.
COVID-19 vaccines were developed in a record time. But the virus is moving faster than the global distribution of vaccines. As on 23rd November 2021, 63.87% of people were vaccinated in rich and high-income countries. Only 7.46% of people were vaccinated in poor and low-income countries.
Costa Rica is demanding the international institutions that the patents of different medicines, and especially the patents of vaccines, are avoided and become public property. It's a need for the world to protect all the population, and to be paying patents is a sin. It's a crime against humanity.
To make it happen, especially the fair distribution, there should be a global consensus to make a vaccine, any product, a global public product. And this is a political choice, a political commitment. When we say it should be a global public good, it's not sharing for the sake of sharing. It's only because it has advantages. For the world to recover faster, it has to recover together.
When it comes to what is called non-excludable and non-rivalrous services, like vector control or prevention of food adulteration, there has always been a recognition for many preventive services that these are public good. What the pandemic teaches us is that it is not enough if we restrict this term of public goods only to a very narrow category. Curative services that reach even the weakest section is necessarily a public good. And there we are using the definition of public good as meaning an area of inherent market failure.
And you don't have this much of freedom applying in a private sector where we do in a public service. And moreover, every time when you see a patient suffering, you need to worry about his economic feeling also. But in a public sector, you don't need to worry about that. You knew very well that his out of pocket of expenditure will going to be zero, and your entire service is definitely will never going to hurt him in economically.
That all the contractual relationships that had been built up for purchasing care from the private sector did not help. And the public sector, with all its weaknesses, with all its understaffing, with all its problems, still ran the day and still was the major provider of care for the majority of the people. And the same doctors who would be criticized for not being very caring were those who did back-to-back night shifts for days together because they had to. And at some point, that is the notion that comes from the notion of public service.
I work in private as well as in public sector. The main difference between private and public sector is I can I'm compelled or I'm forced to prescribe multiple drugs in private sector because it is because of the marketing units. But here in public sector, I can prescribe only the drugs that is needed for the patient.
Jan Swasthya Abhiyan or PHM India has been since beginning monitoring, documenting and building evidence on the implications of such a publicly funded health insurance scheme, which brings in the private sector as providers in a big way. And that has actually led to more inequitable health services and higher catastrophic health expenditure. The growing capture of corporate power, of corporations over global governance and global narratives. That really then promotes policies that put profit over people.
Eso obliga completamente a pensar en otro modelo de desarrollo que no pasa por los objetivos hacia un modo de vida en armonía con la naturaleza, en armonía con el ambiente, que sea sustentable para toda la humanidad y para las generaciones venideras. Entonces, hay que cambiar la matriz energética.
Services in the public sector can compete with those available in your private sector, then your public will actually have somewhere where they can go without even thinking about what they would need to spend. And that is the dream.
The reform of the health service is, of course, to bring it back into the marketplace and degrade it back again into making healthcare a commodity. So it's not reform at all. A caring capitalism, Miliband is talking about this socially responsible capitalism. It's a bit like the Arabian Phoenix, isn't it? Everyone's heard about it, nobody's ever seen one.
International institutions, both health and financial institutions, should have a broader perspective and a more committed attitude toward health for all, because if part of the world is sick and does not have health, the whole world would be sinking.
Una mattina mi sono alzato, oh vela ciao, vela ciao, vela ciao, ciao, ciao. Una mattina mi sono alzato e ho trovato l'invasor, un partigiano, portami via, oh vela ciao, vela ciao, vela ciao, ciao, ciao. Partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morire. Se io muoio da partigiano, oh vela ciao, vela ciao, vela ciao, ciao, ciao. E se io muoio da partigiano.
Well, I hope you really enjoyed that video. I thought it was a real call to arms, and it's certainly given a view of the world we want from the PHM perspective and health services. And I particularly liked the Costa Rica example was fantastic, and that private-public partnerships are there only serving to fail. Very strong messages. And I think that the first two videos have really set the scene for our third and final video, which is on post-pandemic global economics, asking the question of do we need restructure, reform, or just to revitalize? And Ron Labonte is going to introduce those. Ron is an active member of the Canadian Public Health People's Health Movement, and he's also a professor at the University of Ottawa, and he's also been one of the editors who has coordinated the Global Health Watch, which will be published in the coming months. So I'll hand over to Ron to introduce our third and final video. Over to you, Ron.
Okay, thanks very much, Fran, and good morning, good evening, I guess, good day to wherever you happen to sort of be. I'm going to, hang on here a second. Now, when the COVID-19 pandemic arrived in 2020, it quickly collapsed global supply chains and depressed economic activity worldwide. National economies throughout the world that were still struggling in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis were thrown in disarray. So some of which you've already heard on some of the previous videos. Now, almost immediately, there was talk of the need for a post-COVID Great Reset, according to the World Economic Forum, or of governments committing to build back better, a slogan in the US, Canada, and many other countries, and to ensure at least a green recovery. Although pandemic-weary people might crave for what they consider to be a return to normalcy, our economic policies simply cannot default to our old business as usual. Our pre-pandemic economy was already creating massive wealth inequalities, accelerating climate crises, fomenting mass migrations of people who were fleeing poverty, drought, or conflict. And all of this only worsened with the pandemic. Are any of the new policy playbooks arising from the economic chaos of the pandemic sufficient to ensure equity in people's access to the resources needed for health? Or are more radical measures needed to improve health equity globally while ensuring ecosystem sustainability? Are such eco-just measures even compatible with capitalism, however reformed this centuries-old system might become? These are some of the questions I put to three economists who've been thinking critically about such issues for some time: Tim Jackson, Walden Bello, and Jayati Ghosh. And 2 points that they make abundantly clear. We do not need the level or form of economic growth that brought us COVID-19. And we do need a different vision of the role of governments in ensuring that our economies work to improve the health and well-being of all and to protect our environmental commons, as they explain in our third webcast on post-pandemic global economics. Thank you.
Selection, do we have the video? Yeah.
Hello, I am Ron Labonte, a professor at the University of Ottawa in Canada and an activist with the People's Health Movement. Welcome to this webcast on the theme of what sort of post-pandemic economy we need to ensure health equity and to meet the twin challenges of growing wealth inequalities and rapidly accelerating climate change. To begin, the global economy was still struggling with the fallout of the 2008 financial crisis when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, once more rapidly collapsing supply chains and depressing economic activities worldwide. Public health measures to control contagion further disrupted domestic economies and employment through on and off lockdowns of varying stringencies. More so than in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, the pandemic generated a flurry of new calls for a post-COVID Great Reset or a global reboot, emphasizing the need to build back better. All of these headlines hinted at enthusiasm for new policy playbooks and an acceptance that any return to post-pandemic normalcy should not be to the business as usual global economy that was feeding massive inequalities in wealth and the resources people need for health, while placing humanity at ever greater risk of climate change and ecosystem collapse. And so I approached three economists who have given considerable thought to the issue of how our global economy might be restructured to give greater attention to health equity and environmental sustainability. Tim Jackson is an ecological economist and professor of sustainable development at the University of Surrey, and has written on how our growth-based economy is overshooting our planetary resources. Jayati Ghosh is a development economist recently transplanted from India to the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the United States. She has long argued the importance of alternative development models respectful of equity concerns and the environmental limits to growth. Walden Bello is an environmentalist, activist, and professor at the University of Philippines, Diliman. He's a passionate critic for how our present model of globalization has led to financial crises and entrenched inequalities while placing the planet at increasing peril. So I began my conversations with all three of them by reminding them that there were similar hopes for an economic reset after the 2008 global financial crisis. Despite government's massive short-term interventions to rescue a failing economy, most of the world quickly fell back into fiscal austerity. Would it be different this time? Walden answers with a cautious yes.
What we have seen in 2020 and early 2021 is massive government intervention in the economy, whether it's in the global south or the global north. This just showed, that all the neoliberal talk about government intervention is bad, bad, bad. A lot of that just was thrown out of the window. So I think what we've seen is that the ideological sort of assumptions of neoliberalism have been laid low.
But he is wary of the future, and especially how the big monopolies in technology and pharma have profited so much from the pandemic.
I think it is fairly clear now that aside from bringing down or opposing the sort of free market liberalism, we need to be able to start disempowering these powerful monopolies that have taken advantage of the crisis.
Tim began by noting,
we made mistakes coming out of the financial crisis, really punishing mistakes in terms of misunderstanding what the crisis was about, what it said about the economic system, and how we should correct for that.
But our present crisis, he argues, is
different from the previous one, telling us that the people who matter most in society, the ones who protect our lives and care for us and provide and provision for our needs on a daily basis, the ones that we called the frontline workers, the ones that we applauded from our doorsteps during the pandemic, they were the most important people in our society, and yet they were disregarded by capitalism.
The pandemic, he believes, is a pivot point.
In the sense that we can either sort of run away from those lessons and not face them with courage, or in turning towards them, we can understand exactly the parts of the economy that need to have more attention, the bits of society that need more support.
Jayati is a little less optimistic.
I think the signs are very bad. We are seeing not just a return to business as usual, but let's face it, for most of the developing world, it never changed. This pandemic has been remarkable in the diversity of fiscal response. I mean, 80% of the additional fiscal spending since January 2020 has come from just 10 rich countries. More than half of it has come from just the US. The developing world spent less than we did after the global financial crisis. So we have not gone out of that straitjacket at all. We're still very much in the neoliberal straitjacket.
Escaping that neoliberal straitjacket led to a discussion of how this might be accomplished. For Jayati, it begins with a recognition that
we are in the middle, or the beginning, if you like, of a process of immense flux globally in which all kinds of things are going to come out of the churning. And this is also driven by the fact that the pandemic has exposed the almost terminally stupid nationalism of the advanced economies. Whether it's the whole vaccine grab or the subsequent holding on to the intellectual property rights of their own pharma companies, the refusal to provide climate finance that you have promised, they have a complete loss of credibility.
Rather than lament the collapse of multilateralism, she wonders,
is it better then to have different regions charting out strategies that at least will provide some kinds of alternative? I think it is.
A focus on the importance of local and regional levels of governance is a theme common to all three. In Walden's case, it goes back to an argument he first made almost 20 years ago in a book that coined the term deglobalization. In it, he described a necessary double movement of national diversification of economic activity oriented to domestic consumption rather than to export, and a synchronous creation of a pluralist system of global economic governance.
I would say that that vision would still hold for me. Relocalization and ending these global supply chains that have become very vulnerable, and orienting economies away from the thrust of exports in order to be able to serve more domestic needs. I would put the emphasis now also on things like we really need, very active programs of wealth redistribution, and we really need also to make a stronger connection between deglobalization efforts and the efforts to control and climate change. And then unless we do that, we might not succeed.
While less explicit in his interview, Tim's past and influential work on embracing prosperity without growth saw the seeds for such an economy in local or community-based social enterprises, activities that create a greater sense of well-being and fulfillment than the, quote, materialistic supermarket economy, close quote, in which people spend most of their time. Yet these local community betterment activities barely register as economic, much less as growth. As Tim explains,
we're confronted with a sort of dilemma. A continually expanding economy on a finite planet just doesn't seem to realistically be possible. And yet we've built most of our economy around the idea of that expansion and around the idea of growth. We have to begin to explore the structure of the economic system and reform the economic system to make it consistent with the fact that we live on a finite planet on the one hand, and to make it consistent with improving people's well-being.
To some economic reformers, this translates as green growth, the Build Back Better agendas that dominate in high-income countries such as the USA and the European Union. These represent important health, social, and ecological gains. After criticizing the unsustainability of the growth model so rapaciously pursued after the 2008 financial crisis, Jayati describes herself as,
I'm more hopeful about that now than I was then, because I think renewable energy, thanks to China actually, is now competitive. Both solar and wind are actually competitive with all the fossil fuel energy, and in fact cheaper, especially in countries with a lot of sunlight. But in particular, they are amenable to decentralized delivery. And that's a huge thing. You don't need to have acres and acres of solar panels. You can actually set up units in villages, units in particular locations, and so on. And I think that can be transformative.
Well, Walden agrees that green growth is
moving generally in the right direction. I think this techno-optimism is something that I worry about.
And like Tim and Jayati, Walden argues that
just changing from non-fossil fuel resources to more other energy sources without really changing the consumption ethic, attacking the consumption ethic, is not going to really cut it.
Jayati offers another reason to be careful in how we unpack the details of a green growth agenda.
That a lot of the mitigation efforts in the advanced economies rely on precisely what you said: lithium, copper, coltan, etc. A lot of rare earths, which are mined in the most oppressive, exploitative, displacing ways, without concern for the conditions of the people who are being affected, etc. But here's the thing: it doesn't have to be that way. It is that way because of the whole neoliberal paradigm in which you don't look at the rest of it.
She illustrates this with reference to her recent relocation to the Northeast of the United States.
Very liberal, progressive part of the world. Everybody is a recycler. Everybody wants an electric car or has got one. Everybody's into all, green and solar panels in their homes. And everyone feels very virtuous that they are being net zero in their own homes, their own buildings, their own transport, etc. Without realizing that recycling in the US, almost all the waste is exported. They don't stop to think about the mining that is enabling the solar panels or the lithium that is powering the car batteries. And all of these are somehow seen as separate silos.
Instead, she argues that
it's very important for someone who wants to be really green to take this holistic approach.
Tim falls squarely into the holistic camp, being one of the early proponents of what has come to be known as a degrowth, a planned reduction in human consumption to keep the planet within livable ecosystem boundaries. This makes Tim somewhat wary of the green growth mantra, the belief that if we simply decouple economic growth from its material throughput, we can have our cake and eat it too. He recognizes that decoupling our present carbon-based economy is essential, but
what I'm skeptical of is the idea that that in itself will lead us towards a society which can meet its carbon targets at the level at which we need to meet them to combat climate change. And for that, we have no evidence. We have no historical period of time in which we decarbonized fast enough within a capitalist economy to achieve those objectives.
Most of the post-pandemic green recovery packages assumed they would help, in part, by stimulating consumption growth. And therein lies the deep flaw of capitalism.
Decarbonization matters, decoupling matters. Yes, those technologies exist, but we cannot expect them to deliver us the fruits of a zero carbon economy without looking at the underlying economy itself, which is still driving towards expansion, still driving towards consumerism. The incentive structures are pushing us in the wrong direction. And that's the point at which you have to go deeper and explore the dynamics of that underlying economic system.
Capitalism is predicated on ever-increasing production and consumption. And so, as Tim argues, it is not sufficient just to
temper growth. Let's put an adjective in front of growth: green growth, sustainable growth, smart growth. That's not confronting the system enough.
This is not a new caution. I am old enough to remember the seminal 1972 modeling exercise by the Club of Rome, which noted that there are indeed limits to growth. This was the same year the UN convened its first Earth Summit, which brought attention to how our post-war rise in consumerism, while perhaps healthy for the economy, was pathological for the planet, and over a time that is now our present, unhealthy for us. As Walden reminds us, we still haven't internalized this basic economic fact.
Yes, I think that degrowth is a very big imperative for the advanced capitalist societies at this point in time. And that's why I would think that for the countries of the West or the global North, I believe really that degrowth is the only alternative.
The term degrowth is not always liked, even by those environmental activists and economists who share many of the political and economic transformations that it implies. Jeff Sachs, who's an advocate for the green growth agenda, recently described degrowth as a distraction, arguing that there is no incompatibility of having both a decarbonized energy and more energy. Now, Tim challenges the idea that the degrowth agenda is a distraction. Rather,
growth in the GDP is a distraction, and whether you're thinking about increasing it or whether you're arguing that you should decrease it, these are the distraction. And the other thing that's not a distraction is to just stop focusing so much on that as a goal and to focus on the things that matter, to focus on health, to focus on well-being, to focus on the conditions of care in the economy, to focus on the livelihood and the security of livelihoods of people in the economy, and to do that while still focusing on the boundaries of the planet in which we live.
Jayati advances the same argument for a post-pandemic economy, which she believes must
look precisely at the patterns of consumption, the patterns of distribution, patterns of urban planning, how we organize our lives and societies.
These patterns of consumption and distribution intersect in how our present world is so vastly inequitable in both. And so, as Tim explains, it becomes
the responsibility of the richest on the planet to think about the ecological space that's available for the poor to develop. And in prosperity, and it's abundantly clear, it's in the poorest parts of the world that income growth makes a huge difference to prosperity. Life expectancy increases, infant mortality decreases, maternal morbidity decreases, participation in education increases. That's where growth makes a difference.
For this to occur, the unsustainable consumption and emissions profligacy of the advanced economies must go on a committed and regulated diet. Not a decline in prosperity, but a sharp reduction in the consumerism that our economy has ingrained in us and continues to do so. As Walden points out,
there will need to be political and social psychological transformations to take place from societies that have been weaned on overconsumption. I will not underestimate the costs of psychological or social psychological transformation, because that is, we're talking about transformations in the way that we structure our lives.
This will require a new way of thinking about the role of governments in economic planning. Mariana Mazzucato is an influential economist and chairs the World Health Organization's Council on the Economics of Health for All. She has written extensively about how governments should cease trying to repair market failures and instead to prepare or shape markets so that they contribute to solving our social and ecological crises. Her latest book, titled Mission Economy, outlines how governments should establish goal-oriented missions and then mobilize public and private partners to achieve them. The World Health Organization's first council brief is on the topic of vaccine inequity and how a mission partnership for health innovation could have been differently organized. As Jayati, a member of the council Mazzucato chairs, explains,
we are saying if you're going to give stimulus packages, put conditions on the companies. If you're going to give a big subsidy to Moderna to make a vaccine, you make sure that they have to share that technology. If you're going to provide a big subsidy to a bank, you say you cannot do share buybacks for the next 5 years. You cannot do crazy investments in commodity index futures, which will generate big global food prices. So we have to put in conditions.
She goes on to emphasize that
the state has to be thinking from the point of view of the citizenry and then dealing with different elements of the economy, not saying don't have a private sector, just say, make the private sector align with social goals. And that's not something that the market delivers. The market delivers the opposite. So you have to actually shape the market to make it align with the social goals. And that means regulatory practices. That means how you give subsidies or investment or lending, how the central bank lends. All of these have to be in conformity with that.
This is quite a different form of public-private partnerships than the ones that dominated before the pandemic, in which, as Tim cautions, it is too often
the private sector that takes the benefit and it's the public sector that pays the cost. It is a really profound danger, and we see that danger actually, for example, in social care, where there's a huge potential for moral hazard because the government has a duty to maintain networks of social care, which they then contract out to private sector.
Walden is similarly cynical of a related concept, that of stakeholder capitalism. Coined and promoted by Klaus Schwab, founder of the World Economic Forum, the idea is to replace the disastrous short-termism of shareholder capitalism with corporate efforts to give everyone a stake in the fruits of market growth. But as Walden warns, it is really
to bring the opponents of capitalism to a common venture of extending its lifespan, okay? And without addressing the centrality of the profit motive, that basically it is the transformation of society as well as nature into commodities from which big capital, can extract profits. It's another one of those false solutions that I see happening.
Mazzucato's mission economy he sees as moving
generally in the right direction. I would say, that the central role of government in bringing us towards a more ecologically sustainable national as well as a global economy is really quite important. However, I would put the emphasis on democratized government, that and participatory government, that basically involves people with all the messiness that this creates, that involves people in really being part of the solutions to their problems. And that's why I would say the importance of civil society in having a very strong role in surveilling and making sure that government interventions are headed in the right way, and the process of governance itself being, participatory.
This brought our conversations around to how this new economic transformation is to be paid for. Tim and Jayati both describe what has become known as modern monetary theory, or MMT, which is actually an older economic argument dating back to the Second World War. As Tim explains, it speaks to government's responsibilities for
functional finance, where you judge the outcome of government spending in terms of what it achieves in the economy, in terms of your social and ecological goals, your social goals in particular. The fundamental insight that I think was to some extent demonstrated by the way that governments responded through the pandemic. There is, for any government that issues its own sovereign currency, can never run out of money in the way that a household can run out of money. A government is not a household. And that fundamental insight gives us the space that we need to create monetary and fiscal policies that are flexible, that are coordinated, and that give government the space to maneuver as we navigate these huge environmental and social challenges that are facing us, irrespective of growth. Lifting the veil, or removing the fig leaf, as the New York Times called it, of the ideology that says that government cannot afford to spend in the well-being of its citizens.
Jayati also supports the basic insight arising from MMT.
That yes, governments can spend, and that is not dependent on your tax revenues or anything like that. And that yes, central banks can and have in the past, for centuries, put money into important social and developmental projects.
She is concerned, though, that MMT is
really meant for countries that have their own reserve currencies, who have the luxury of being able to spend without facing immediate capital flight, balance of payments crises, credit downgrades, sovereign debt problems, etc., etc.
Walden is more skeptical of the ability of modern monetary theory to be at least a singular solution.
Governments, can in fact create money, and that this could be used for, public interventions. Let's not think that this is costless. One definitely can be a more active interventionist in fiscal and monetary policy, but hey, we need to be able to generate the resources to support that, which means you really have to have radical taxation program.
He argues the importance of raising marginal tax rates.
Back to the period when they were 85 to 90% of the taxes of the top income earners of the population. So I don't think there's any avoiding the fact that those resources will have to be taken from the rich.
Tim and Jayati also share the importance of rapidly scaling up progressive taxation. Now, this is not a new health or social justice concern, albeit it is one that many rich world governments are still reluctant to act upon with the assertiveness that our twin crises of inequality and climate change demand. Tim wistfully points to
the amount of things that you could do either with the taxation system or with the money system or with the coordination of those things or the ability of the government to intervene in those places. All of that can be done as soon as you kind of lift that ideological veil that that's not government's role and it has to be handed to the market.
As Walden notes, it really comes down to
a struggle over the surplus produced by human beings, and I think I think that's really what is at stake at this point in time. Resources are finite. Besides, when we talk about whether it's fiscal policy or monetary policy, I think we need to see, but what for? The use of policy has to be always put in the context of what interests that it serve. What interests really, what is the objective that we're moving towards through the use of such fiscal and monetary mechanisms.
In addressing the question of what sort of health for all fiscal and monetary policies are developing countries lacking the reserve currency privileges of the global north, Jayati notes that
it's very context specific. But let's take a low middle income country like India which has a reasonable amount of fiscal space. It would mean that, for example, you would make central bank direct lending and underwriting of other loans for specific kinds of investment, whether it is climate mitigation or adaptation. You would have massive public investment in the care economy.
The importance of a care economy is one all three economists emphasize, noting how the pandemic made its importance central to any semblance of any ethical economic recovery. For Jayati, that centrality of the care economy is an extension of what
feminist economists have always talked about care in a much broader sense. There is the direct care, which is looking after people, the young, the old, the sick, etc., and the cooking, cleaning, all of that. Then there's extended care, doing things that help in adaptation to climate change. It is essential work that is being done in unpaid fashion by a significant part of the population.
The implication here is that a post-pandemic economy must begin to reward financially, support financially, those who contribute to the care of people and planet. As Tim points out,
health is the main aim of prosperity. Health is the foundation for prosperity. Then you need to be able to figure out how to create a care economy. And the care economy is a very different place. It's not about the productivity with which we produce and consume material goods. It's about the time spent in service of human beings in the service of other people. And that service-based economy, that economy based around labor and attention and care to one another, to the task of craft and building things, to the creativity that enriches our lives, that is a very different economics, a very different economy.
Protecting this care economy is essential in the transition of what Tim calls a post-growth world and extends to
the kind of refurbishment of our buildings, the care of our buildings, the care of our communities, the care of our wetlands and our habitats.
A review of his latest book, Post-Growth or Life After Capitalism, criticized him for being one of those utopian socialists, to which he replies,
utopianism sometimes gets a bad rap. The idea of a utopia is a kind of creative space where you can think differently about this society and test out ideas. And that's sometimes the hardest thing in the world to do when you're under a sense of pressure and a sense of, we have to make actions, we have to make decisions now, we have to respond to climate change, we have to reverse the decline in biodiversity, we have to solve the problem of inequality in society. And then you're just a rabbit in the headlights, unable to see where to go. And so one of the things that I'm really keen on is that there are processes within government that are able to take the longer view, that are able to be strategic, that are able to think through and face some of these issues and these risks that we are trying to solve on the hoof as life tears us away in another direction all of the time. And to create that space, in fact, to connect what we're doing now to the generations that will come afterwards.
For Walden, the collapse of that space is his preeminent concern.
We are in a race between the forces of the far right and progressive forces. And I think we should not underestimate the importance of right-wing authoritarian forces that inevitably tend to be anti moves to deal with the climate crisis. One of the first things that's going to suffer is precisely any sort of coordinated global action on climate.
And so Walden concludes our conversation by noting that this is precisely why he has been persuaded to run as a vice presidential candidate in the 2022 Philippines election. But he also cautions,
we can't leave it to the politicians. We've got civil society to now step in, because if we leave it up to the usual actors, we're not going to get anywhere.
A message that echoed as the meeting halls of COP26 emptied just a few weeks ago. Jayati describes herself as a big fan of changing everything, but she has also learned the value of taking
thin end of the wedge approach. I'm saying, let's just do whatever we can in whichever way we can. That opens it up a little bit. Let's think of these spaces we can open up in whichever way possible. Let me give you an example. If supposing you say that we really have to create development banks funded by a central bank, which will take up the climate investments that we know we all need. If those are successful, it's a step towards people saying, well, why do we need the private banks? What's the good they're doing? But if you simply arrive and say, all banks to be nationalized, it's not going to work. So you have to actually do it that other way.
In the end, none of the three have a simple recipe book for the eco-just transformation that we need. But they offer many suggestions for how we can refine and promote such a transformation. And one point on which they all agree, the model of all-consuming capitalism that we have been living with, and especially its exponential growth over the last 70 years, is no longer fit for purpose, if that purpose is improving health equity and ensuring a livable planet. Thank you for listening in.
Well, thanks so much, Ron, for being the anchor in that amazing discussion. And as I think Tim Jackson said, there's a lot of value in utopianism. But I think what the video showed also is that it is possible to have the resources to achieve the world that PHM wants, that's much more equitable, sustainable. So thanks a lot, Ron, for doing that. It's fantastic. And again, like the other two videos, it will be available on the PHM YouTube site. So you can use it for teaching or for mobilizing and activism along with the other two. Now, for the rest of our session, I'm handing over to Sundar. And Sundar is a highly regarded academic in India, I know. And but from the PHM point of view, Sundar has been our global coordinator for the last 3 or so years, and he's just finishing his term. And Sundar is going to moderate a discussion, and then to close, Roman Vega from Colombia, who's the new PHM coordinator, is going to close our meeting. And don't forget, I'll hand over to Sundar, but don't forget you can put comments in chat, you can ask questions on the Q&A. So over to you, Sundar. Sundar, you're muted.
Okay. Thank you, Fran. There are 1 or 2 questions in the Q&A which I would start with. But before that, let me note a word of thanks to the Prince Mahidol Award Conference for their support, for making these videos and their partnership in this. And that has really been a good experience for us. And this whole theme of the conference, we have been trying to put the PHM perspective on it into a form in which it is much more easy for people to access. Now, I saw some of the questions are addressing some of the people who are interviewed who are not there. They are just there on the video, but they are not there in the panel or in the audience. But one question that I would start with is Gautam Sen's question that I would, Professor Gautam Sen, great friend, he is been a professor in a leading public medical college and now works in expansion and real champion of primary healthcare. But his point has been 2 points that we fully agree with. That one is that we need a major change in the medical education system and professional education system if we are going to get anywhere with equitable health systems. And we also need to actually, the other point that he was making is that we need to actually ensure that there is a certain degree of regulation and encouragement for them, that they are not, it's not only a dichotomy. But I think Jayati answered his question on why the dichotomy is there in the first place. In her interview, she said that one of our challenges, we're not against the private sector as such, but to make the private sector aligned with the social goals remains the challenge. There are many not-for-profits who don't maximize their income, but they are actually looking at it as public service who come into the whole frame. But I think the point is well taken that at some point a lot more goes into making for public service rather than just public ownership on that. There is no, if there is any other question, you can raise this, but I see that in one question that Paul has asked, can I invite Ron to answer? I read out the question. Can a sustainable global society on a healthy planet be reached without stopping and reversing human population growth? Should degrowth include fewer people living better lives? Ron, would you like to take that on?
Yes, and the simple answer to that question, Paul, is yes. Living creatures, regardless of whether they're human or other kinds of creatures, we consume planetary resources. If we outgrow in our consumption the ability of the planet to regenerate those resources, we're basically creating a kind of slow ecocidal suicide. Now, the problem that comes in is that population growth is driven by many different factors, and the emphasis in the past has really been about slowing the population growth in the poorest sectors of the human population. But we know in terms of their planetary consumption, it's a tiny fraction of what the wealthy are consuming. So we have this global north-south, rich-poor divide that really needs to be challenged first or primarily if we're going to be concerned about kind of any sort of population dimensions. When you have the wealthier north having kind of created the massive emissions, grown very wealthy through the exploitation or impoverishment of others, and then to be concerned about population growth in the global south, it smacks of the worst form of kind of neo-colonial privileging. So the short answer is yes, we need to sort of look at ensuring that our human population does not grow beyond the capacity of our planet's abilities to regenerate the resources for life. We're pretty much at that point, so we do need to sort of see a way in which we can ethically and equitably see a decrease in overall population. But we primarily have to be concerned about the historical and political inequities that have created such discordance between the wealthier north and the poorer south.
Fran, there's a question I'm going to turn your way from Labila Musoke. What is the radical way to get the state to invest in public health systems? It goes on to say, yet they seek medical care from abroad, but I assume you're talking of the leadership and the bureaucracy, and I while abroad. But at some point, what would you think?
Well, I mean, the ironic thing is you would have thought that a pandemic would have made people see the sense of that. But unfortunately, so many countries have turned to the private sector to deal with the pandemic. But what that has shown is that usually the public sector is much better than doing that. In the UK, for instance, the test and trace system was outsourced to the private sector and it was a disaster, whereas the vaccination was done in the national health system and it was greatly successful. So I think in some ways the usual argument, oh, we can't really afford a public health system, we have to have a private system. I think that's been so well answered in the third video on post-pandemic global economics. I mean, if we accept that countries, that you know, the private sector should be regulated, that there should be participatory democracy that Weldon Bello talked about, then I think we can see that the way is open then to be able to finance that. But it is going to require a re-education of our public servants even, because so many of them have drunk the idea of the private sector, of public-private partnerships. And I think one of the things we have to do is use videos such as the 3 we've got to show them to community people and say, look, there are alternatives. We don't have to keep going along this terrible path. I think Ron talked about 70 years of rampant capitalism, that we actually can confront that system. We can make it more participatory, and we can use the private sector for the public good by regulating it. But if it's left to its own devices, it won't be equitable, it won't be sustainable, and it just will not stress the public good. So I think it is that re-education of society about the value of a strong public sector in so many parts of our society, but also of the dangers of this unregulated private sectors.
There's one question that I direct towards Ron, and then another that I'll read out for Sulakshana. So Dan Owala has asked that corporate capture of health systems is the monster that has pushed countries in the global south to worse deaths, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. Hypothetically speaking, could stabilizing the dollar and targeting natural resources their objective? I mean, is it, I don't know whether it's a comment saying that that's their objective, or is that a solution to this issue is a question. And then I was wanting Sulakshana to respond to 2 things. One is the how much is the growth of corporate industries outside the health industry influencing global policies, and also whether the role of the promoting a family medicine physician as a solution to equitable healthcare is also something that's been asked in tangentially. Ron?
Thank you, Sundar, but could you just remind me what the question was? Because I seem to have missed it.
The question is a bit it asks on the thing as to whether the thing let me myself get that right. So corporate capture is the monster that pushed countries in the global south to worse debts, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. What is their objective? Stabilizing the dollar and targeting natural resources, or how is that relationship? I mean, what drives corporate capture of health systems? Or it's a question that you'll have to interpret a bit.
What drives the corporate capture of health systems? Kind of quite simply, capital accumulation. I mean, it's profitable to sort of try to move into the health sector. One of the things that as we sort of see these debates about privatization and the public-private partnership models, which is that those are being pushed very heavily by many of the government or non-governmental kind of more World Economic Economic Forum sorts of actors in terms of a post-pandemic economics. It basically sort of says we need to sort of tap into the incredible wealth of private equity firms and the investor class, et cetera, without questioning why they became so wealthy in the first point. But we need to tap into that, into these kinds of partnerships for social impact, to create positive social impact, in kind of environmental bonds, social impact bonds, et cetera, as the World Economic Forum likes to put it, you can make a profit and save the world. But all of those ideas rest on the fact that they know that governments will backstop when those partnerships fail, that governments will continue to correct for market failures. So investors can very heavily move into the health sector, into the education sector, into these other kind of public good domains with a fair degree of certainty that should they kind of extract whatever profit they want to make out of it and the things begin to fall apart, governments will step in and sort of, quote, save the political day. So we need to be extremely wary about how we enter into those kinds of partnerships.
Yeah, and I think we'll close with, because we said we'll keep to a limited time, we'll close with these two questions to Sulakshana. Sulakshana, one of the views that you expressed is that the growth of anti-health industries influencing global policies as well as global health policies as well as global public health and ecology. And the other, which is I'm taking from Arun Srivastav's comment, friend of ours we know well, is how to re-establish in popular perception and political discourse the role of public systems in health and well-being, as post-COVID trauma created the space for it.
Yeah. So I think to answer the first question, certainly, I mean, we have been, as part of PHM, have been analyzing the commercial determinants of health. So all the industries that really lead to, ill health, including the, private healthcare sector. So articulating that also as within the framework of commercial determinants of health. And then we, so the sort of the alternative is to go back to what we have been, we presented in our video on the equitable health systems. And more we are seeing such corporations across thematics, I mean, across various sectors, influence global governance, influence national governance through multi-stakeholder arrangements. And I'll share a few links to some of the work that PHM has been doing with other sectoral campaigns and movements, on this issue. And I think, I think this is really a high time. I think when Fran mentioned that we governments and, all of us really push the agenda, of strengthening public systems, because we've, seen how the kind of privatized, market-oriented and commercialized, systems, whether it's of healthcare, whether it is of aged care in a lot of the northern countries, really, sort of did not really happen for people and did not really come through for people. But I just wanted to make one point in this, is that when we talk about budgets, now more and more we are seeing that there's an emphasis on public budgets and public financing. However, there is an equal emphasis on strategic purchasing from the private sector. So it's not only that our government budgets, we demand that our budgets improve, our health budgets improve. We have to also parallelly demand that this money has to be invested into the public system, into the government health system, into the public infrastructure, into our health workers that are employed by government, and not really outsourced and not really given to the for-profit private sector through outsourcing to private insurance companies, through a publicly funded insurance, or through public-private partnerships or contracting. So I think this is the right time, and I think events like this and coalitions and movements like this, also building solidarity with other movements and campaigns, will really ensure that we take this message forward.
So before I hand back to Fran, I'd just like to say a few words of acknowledgement and thanks for a number of people who have helped. I will not be giving a comprehensive list because all the people who came on the screen can be considered to have been acknowledged, but there were many who did not. And surprisingly, our film directors, both Sivakumar, who of Siva Films, who made the first two, and Neha Mishra, who was the film producer for the third, video producer for the third, need to be gratefully acknowledged for the excellent work they put in within a small time. And among the people who were consultants and helping in the content, Devki Nandiyar gave a long time and a considerable effort for the SDGs 1 without on a pro bono basis, and we're really grateful for the time she spent on that. And a lot of people at the Secretariat, Jyotsna and Deepika, facilitated many of the transactions which were done along with this whole for this preparation, and it's an immense role that they played. I know, and for some of the interviews, all our local PHM regional and local country coordinators, Maria for Latin America, Dylan in Philippines, and there were others in each area who coordinated. So I think I gratefully acknowledge that, and of course to PMAC, I've already made my thing. So now I hand over to Fran for more.
That's lovely, Sundar, and I'd like to acknowledge your role. You were sort of the coordinator who brought all this together and the anchor to make sure it all worked. So that was really important, and thank you for that.
The editorial committee, I must mention Paul also has played a role on that in the editorial.
Yeah, well, the names have been shown on the film anyway. So thanks so much, Sundar, for that. Well, we're coming to the end of our session. And I think I mentioned that Sundar is just finishing his term as Global Coordinator of PHM, and Roman Vega is just about to start as Global Coordinator. So we've asked Roman to just close this event and to just introduce himself to you. He, like Sundar, comes with a very strong academic background as well as an activist background in Latin America, and lives in Bogota in Colombia. So over to you, Roman.
Thanks, Fran, very much for giving me this opportunity to close this presentation, this wonderful work that you has been doing with a few words. Just I have to say that all three videos have clearly identified the problems and the challenges that we are living in this epoch. These are not only problems of human beings, but all kind of life on Earth. So what has been shown is that we have to confront this situation as it has been done in the past, in the 18th, 19th, 20th, and now, 21st century. The problems we are confronting have a lot of consequences in terms of health inequities that are not the result just of an unfair health system, but also of the kind of society in which we are living with. So what we have to think is how to solve the problems we are living just now. We has been moving around certain kind of advances and setbacks in the background of an economic, cultural, and political system dominated by a capitalist rationality. The problem is, how can we transform this capitalist rationality that inform every kind of decisions we are making in the state, in civil society, and in terms of our relationship as human beings with nature. That is the challenge. It seems that we cannot transform the situation we are living without changing the capitalist rationality that is embedded in the modern epoch. That is the problem. But that intent of transforming this rationality has not been easy. We have experienced ways of doing it since, you know, the socialist view of transforming society to the progressive, we can say, New Deal that has been put into practice and has been proposed just at the moment to confront the situation we are living with. We know what we have to achieve, but still we have many problems in understanding how to achieve that we want to do. So that is the problem. My view regarding this aspect is that at least we have a strong health movement embedded in PHM experience, and at the different from the past, we now can discuss and to mobilize civil society to try to create a different view on what health should be, that is not only related to access to medical health services and technologies, but to the transformation of conditions of life and our relationship with nature. That is the new problem we are confronting just now. So I think Fran, Sundar, and Solaksana and Ron, that what you have done with these videos is to put the discussion on the table and to call the people to act, to reflect, and to mobilize for transforming the real situation we are living just at this moment, at this epoch, where human beings and all life can disappear from the Earth planets. Thank you very much. I have to congratulate you because of the fabulous work and to propose you to disseminate all over the world these very great videos that you have realized in the context of PMAC. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Sundar. And once again, thanks to PMAC for enabling this and for us being part of their side meeting. And lots of solidarity to everyone across the world who's joined us. So good morning, good afternoon, good night, depending on where you are. And PHM wishes you farewell and hopes that you'll join our struggle for health for all. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Yes, thanks to all of you. It was really marvelous.
Siva.
Bye.